Hey everyone, I have a really special book haul video to do today, and it's not because I bought some new books, though that's great if you have the opportunity to do that, but today I want to talk about a really special collection of books that I brought to my house here. And why they're special to me is because a number of years ago, when I was on my way to move to New York City, I took my book collection and left it at my parents' house in the Midwest. We're talking hundreds of books, I'm not sure how many, but a whole Jeep's worth of books for the most part. And I went back to the Midwest to visit my family because one of my sisters was getting married. And so I decided to take some of the books back with me on the airplane, though of course I was only able to choose a tiny fraction of the books to bring back with me, basically what could fit in a carry-on piece of luggage. And so I had to, of course, pick books that not only were immediately accessible for me to grab and sort through, but I also wanted to choose ones that were special to me. And so I chose about a dozen or maybe 15 books from my collection there in the attic. Also, part of what I was doing was sorting through the books to make sure nothing had been damaged through humidity, which is a big issue in certain areas of the Midwest. But thankfully, there seemed to be a kind of humidity sort of temperature control system that was there in the attic that prevented most of the books from being damaged. I had a few that looked like they had, but it seems for the most part I was rather fortunate. So let's have a look. In a couple of cases, there were books that I considered to be particularly rare or for personal reasons not replaceable. And so these, because I was worried about things like silverfish or mold affecting them, I actually, as you saw, had them in Ziploc bags. Now, one such book that is not replaceable is a copy that I have of Laura Hillenbrand's Unbroken, which for those of you who are familiar with the book is about a man named Louis Zamperini, who was an Olympian and was in the Second World War, was shot down. He served on the crew of a B-24 and spent a considerable amount of time at sea, something like 100 days in a life raft, before being picked up and put into a Japanese prisoner of war camp. Now, the reason that this book is not replaceable is because it was signed to me by Louis Zamperini, who has since passed away. And so I'm not able to replace this book, which is why I stored it the way that I did. Now, another book that I sealed up in such a way is Joseph Anton by Salman Rushdie. Now, I have not met Rushdie, though I've seen him speak in person. This book is a signed copy, which I bought at a bookstore in Cambridge, England. I studied at the same college that Rushdie did, and so I found this at a bookstore there and noticed that it was signed. They might have had the author there for an event, and so I have this now. Two more signed copies of books that I brought back with me are actually from a sort of non-traditional author by a man named Buzz Aldrin, who of course was the second man to step foot on the moon. Now I have a signed copy of Encounter with Tiber with a foreword by Arthur C. Clarke, and I have a signed copy of Mission to Mars. Now the first one, Encounter with Tiber, I had signed to me when I was a boy. I met Mr. Aldrin at a bookstore with my sister. I got a photograph with him, and he personalized the book for me. The second book, Mission to Mars, I got when I was an adult. It's not personalized to me. I just went to a regular signing and I didn't speak with him then. So that's it for signed copies, and that just leaves other books that are special to me for personal reasons or ones which made themselves readily available for me to take home. The next book is The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt. For those of you who are familiar with this, it's what I would consider, and what I think other people would consider, one of the most interesting presidential biographies ever written, winner of the Pulitzer Prize by Edmund Morrison, who passed away a few years ago. This book details the time frame of Theodore Roosevelt's life from the time he was a boy until right when he becomes president, and then it drops off from there, or stops from there rather. Morris eventually, years later, went on and wrote two more books, one about the presidency and then one about Roosevelt's life after the presidency. All very good books. Next up is another personal favorite. It's Brideshead Revisited by Evelyn and Waugh. Now, people who have been following the channel for a while probably have picked up on the fact that I'm a bit of a Waugh fanboy. I actually have 4 copies of this book now, one of which is an American First Edition. And so this is the first copy I ever received. And for a long time, it was my favorite book until I read Moby Dick. and now it's my second favorite book, but a lot of fond memories of this book. In many ways, reading Brideshead Revisited was one of my motivating factors for going to study abroad in England, though unlike Waugh and his protagonist in the book, I did not study at Oxford. I was at Cambridge. On the topic of Oxford, though, I have purchased from the Bodleian Library at Oxford Instructions for American Servicemen in Britain, 1942. This was published by the War Department out of Washington, D.C., and was issued to American servicemen in Britain during World War II. And the reason I purchased it is because my grandfather was one such serviceman. He was in the Army Air Corps, stationed in England, and was a navigator on a B-17 cruise. So I thought this was particularly interesting to see, and so I bought it. On the topic of aviation, another book that I'm fond of that I brought with me is Donald W. Douglas, A Heart with Wings. Now, I have an interest in aviation because I have a lot of aviators in my family, though I don't work directly in the aviation industry. I previously had a job that was sort of aviation adjacent. I like this book because I live here in the west side of Los Angeles, and the Douglas Company for many years made aircraft here in Santa Monica and in the city of Long Beach. Later on, at the end of the war, they actually produced B-17s, the aircraft that my grandfather flew, through a license with Boeing. And of course, they most famously made the Douglas DC-3. On the topic of the Douglas Company, I also have Ed Heinemann's Combat Aircraft Designer. Heinemann was the most famous aircraft designer who worked for the Douglas Company and designed aircraft such as the A-4 Skyhawk, and was a local here in Los Angeles and went to high school here. This is, I don't think, a particularly common book, and so I brought it back with me. It was a gift from my father. So to wrap back to the topic of Cambridge, I have the Poetical Works of Rupert Brooke, which I bought there. Brooke, like Salman Rushdie, went to King's College at Cambridge. I'm sure some of you are familiar with his poetry. He famously died in the First World War, and when he was, I believe, 27. I'm a particular fan of his works because when we were at Cambridge, we would go to Grantchester, which is a sort of little village that's adjacent to Cambridge, and one of his poems deals with that town in particular. Next up, I have This Side of Paradise by F. Scott Fitzgerald. I read this book around the time that I made some friends of mine and acquaintances whom I still am acquainted with and friends to this day, and so it's a book that I read at a particular time that is special to me, and so the book in turn is special to me. This is by Everyman's Library, which I'm a huge fan of. I think their paper and print quality is top-notch, and I really enjoy reading their books. Another book from an important period of my life is George Orwell's Coming Up for Air, which is not one of his better-known novels, but still good in its own right. I read this, this was the last novel I read before going to university, and so it's special to me. And next up, we have the Palgrave Macmillan Dictionary of Political Thought by Roger Scruton. This was recommended to me in my first political science class I ever took by a teacher I was rather fond of. It's basically just a dictionary of political terms, and you look one up and you can read about and learn about it, sort of like Wikipedia, but probably higher quality. Written by Roger Scruton, who I think for a long time, and I don't think most people would disagree with me, considered the top conservative author and writer in Britain while he was alive. He passed away a couple of years ago. Another political theory book that I have is Princeton Readings in Political Thought, which is a collection of writers extending all the way back into antiquity to our own time, different political theorists, philosophers. This was one of my earlier works that I became acquainted with different writers of political theory. And actually why it's sort of special to me is because years later, I would discover that a coffee shop that me and my girlfriend would go to in New York City, as far as we can tell, this book was edited and compiled there because at the coffee shop there's covers of different books that presumably were written or edited there. This is near Columbia University, and this was one of the books there. Next up, I have a collection of Henry David Thoreau's work from the Library of America, which is sort of like Everyman's Library in terms of binding, print, and paper quality. I got this, I believe, from the Book Den in Santa Barbara, which is California's oldest continuously operating bookstore. Next up, I have The Blue and the Gold, Volume 1 and Volume 2. These were written by a man named Clark Kerr, who for a number of years was the president of the University of California, and prior to that, he was the chancellor of UC Berkeley. He was famously the chancellor at Berkeley during the free speech movement there in the 1960s, and then later on, as I said, went to become the president of the University of California. Now, as an alum of the University of California, I have degrees from 2 different campuses. I'm particularly interested in his story because my honors thesis when I was in undergrad was about a thing called the loyalty oath controversy, which had to do with McCarthyism, communism, and essentially forcing faculty at the University of California to sign a anti-communist loyalty oath. And so that was a topic that I wrote extensively on, and which actually brings me to the topic of the next book, which is a book called The Searching Light by Martha Dodd. Now, this is a novel. It's not particularly well known, but Martha Dodd is sort of infamous because she was the daughter of an American ambassador to Germany in the 1930s, and Dodd famously had communist sympathies. She later defected to the Soviet Union and was a Soviet spy, but she was an American. So she wrote this novel. I collected it as sort of a piece of as a sort of collectible while I was working on the project about McCarthyism in the University of California. All right, and on to a happier topic. A personal favorite of mine, some of you I'm sure are familiar with this, is Edward Abbey's Desert Solitaire. Now, I would classify Edward Abbey as, I would say he's sort of a neo-transcendentalist. His writing, he died in the late 1980s. His writing, I think, is similar in spirit to the transcendentalists like Emerson and Thoreau, though of course closer to our own times. Desert Solitaire is one of those beautiful and really happy books that I think will make you sort of regain hope in everything, and I would definitely recommend it to anyone who's interested, particularly if you like nature writing. And next we have Plain Style by Christopher Lasch. Now, this is actually kind of an odd one out. I just needed to fill up extra space, so I grabbed it and threw it in. I'm actually not really sure where I got it from, and I don't think I've read it, but I do like collecting style guides and things of that nature, linguistic books. All right, next up we have a couple of noir books. We have The Postman Always Rings Twice by James M. Cain, considered one of the earlier works of Los Angeles noir. You know, I'm a big fan of Raymond Chandler and other noir authors, Dashiell Hammett. This is a good book, not particularly long, but interesting. And then on the topic of that, in terms of nonfiction, we also have L.A. Noir by John Bunton, which deals with the real world inspirations for L.A. Noir as it is as a fictional genre. Next up, we have Ex Libris by Anne Fadiman, professor and writer, obviously. She's written a handful of books. I wish she could have written more. She's still alive, so there's still time. This is a collection of essays about literature and books, and touches on interesting topics that I like, such as the concept of reading books in locations where they're set. So if you travel somewhere to read literature that has to do with that particular location. I'm a big fan of literary destinations, so you guys probably already know that. So I like to go visit places after I've read certain books or visit places that authors have lived. All right, we have just a couple more. Now I have, printed by the U.S. Postal Service, The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. Now I'm not particularly a philatelist. Other people in my family are. I'm entertained by stamps, but I'm not really a collector, though in this case I made an exception. This was a few years ago. This must have been, it was for the bicentennial of Edgar Allan Poe's birth, and it came with a collection of stamps that the USPS made in honor of that. And then of course here's the text of his most famous poem. I also have, that I brought home with me, a copy of Poe from Everyman's Library, Pocket Poets edition, which I'm a big fan of the Pocket Poets by Everyman. I think they're a great size. You can take them with you easily, and the printing quality, like everything that Everyman does as a publishing company, is excellent. So would definitely recommend that. I have a number of other editions by them for different poets, and also collections. They do collections based on themes like Christmas or Thanksgiving, that sort of thing. And I also have Miracle Cure by Harlan Coben. Now, this was given to me by my girlfriend, presumably because she read it on a flight and then gave it to me as a present. I think it's personalized to me here. Yes, it is. I haven't actually read any of his stuff. She's crazy about it. I'm not a huge mystery person, but perhaps eventually I will get to reading this. And also here I have a little assortment of ephemera and collectibles that I brought home with me. One of which is a playbook of a presentation of Macbeth that I saw at the Globe Theatre in London. When I saw it, one of the hobbits from Lord of the Rings, from the films, was playing the character of Banquo, so that was a fun experience. And some of the other things I brought home, a little collection of leather bookmarks. One from the Bodleian, have one from 221B Baker Street, so it's Sherlock Holmes themed. And I have one from King's College at Cambridge. Also have a handy London map and guide with instructions for the Underground, and then just a number of different pamphlets. St. John's College at Cambridge, the history of the Orchard at Grantchester, where you can get tea, and another bookmark from the Bodleian, which is Julius Caesar themed, and flyer from when I saw King Lear when it was the Globe on tour, which came to Cambridge. This was interesting because the character of King Lear was played by the man who played the butler at from Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, who was actually really, really good in the role. One of my favorite presentations that I've ever seen. And another pamphlet from the Sherlock Holmes Museum. If you haven't been to that, I would recommend it. When I went, it was sort of at the height of the popularity of the television series, a sort of contemporary adaptation of it, with that fellow with the strange name, the actor who has been in some of those Marvel comic movies. Actually, a fun little thing that I picked up while I was there is they had fake business cards for Sherlock Holmes that you could get, as though if you wanted to hire a private investigator, and I've actually had that in my wallet since we went there. And lastly, a little bookmark from the Last Bookstore here in Los Angeles, which if you haven't checked out, easily one of the coolest bookstores in California, located in an old bank building in downtown Los Angeles. All right, well, that's all for now. I'll see you all next time. Eventually, I hope to get the rest of my books, but I'm probably going to have to put up a few more shelves before I do that. All right, so have a happy Thanksgiving.